Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Politica channel. This video will be a follow-up to the previous video on fascism, which is an important and interesting subject, and something that's been thrown around recently quite a lot, with different sides accusing each other of being fascist. So we're going to dig into the subject and do some scoring and maybe come up with some surprising results. Because it's a sensitive topic, full disclosure once again, I am Jovan Grahovec. I am Serbian American. I am also a professor of strategic management, currently on a break due to the widespread vaccine mandates across American universities, a topic about which I will talk some other time. I'm also politically independent. I'm neither Republican nor Democrat, and I'd like to get us to think about fascism in a way that's anchored in Mussolini's definition of fascism. So we're going to actually try to bring some rigor to this discussion. I would also like you to try to just look at the arguments themselves and not allow your political predispositions to interfere too much, or at least to the extent possible. In management, we like to emphasize how important it is for managers and entrepreneurs to manage companies based on facts rather than based on their assumptions that they may have about the markets and technologies and so forth. So we'll try to analyze how fascist different sides of the political spectrum really are, and as I said, we're going to anchor that discussion in Mussolini's definition. Right away we can analyze which side is more integrated with the corporate world and where are these links more incestuous, and that will give us one way to score who is more fascist than the other side maybe. There are also other characteristics of fascism that kind of naturally follow this type of social arrangement, and we'll talk about those as well. The first one is hierarchy. If you're going to have this kind of oligarchy that arises due to the merger of the corporate and the political class, of course this oligarchy will seek special treatment for itself and will try to apply a different set of rules for those below them. Hierarchy is one of the hallmarks of fascist societies, and it's almost like a food chain or a pyramid. You have large corporations and state executive and legislature and judicial branch on top, but then you have this kind of structure replicated at regional and provincial and municipal levels, in which you have these bureaucrats, everyone at their level, and they carve their own space, and they have buddy-buddy relationships with maybe smaller enterprises. The next one would be obviously crackdown on individual and group rights. Individual freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, even property rights, and other individual rights will be suppressed, and that will be another hallmark of fascist societies. A third one would be authoritarianism. If you're going to have a rule by oligarchy, they will tend to impose their own will without really much regard for any kind of formal decision-making mechanisms and so forth. So you'll see lots of arbitrary decisions imposed on the entire society without much due process and without much recourse that individuals below may have to these imposed measures on them. And the fourth one will be often nationalism, especially in the classical 20th century fascist societies. These oligarchies will tend to impose their will on the largest possible space. So to the extent possible, fascist states will tend to attack neighbors and try to expand territorially so that this oligarchy can govern over a larger space. And we saw this on the example of Italy. Another important role of nationalism is because internally it allows the oligarchy to label anybody who disagrees with them a traitor, a threat to the nation, and use that as an excuse to crack down on political opponents. However, this is, as argued in the previous video, this is not a necessary component. It's a convenient component and convenient tool of fascist oligarchies to impose their will on the society that they govern, but it's not necessary. And for example, we saw in the case of Portugal not being threatened by its neighbors and having troubles holding on to the empire in the run-up to the Second World War. Their dictatorship didn't really push this idea of nationalism too much. It was more about Catholicism and national unity inside Portugal, and not about expansionist nationalism that we saw in Italy and other fascist societies. We also argued that in the modern world, in the 21st century, the merger between corporations and political authorities will necessarily look different given the global nature of modern corporations that were not present in Mussolini's time. So given that many industries nowadays are dominated by a handful of truly global corporations, and given that especially in the IT space we have Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and others that are really truly corporations with global reach, with tremendous global power, if they're going to merge with the state, it's going to look different, and it's difficult to imagine why the resulting fascist regimes would push nationalism. If anything, they may push globalism, and they may want to crack down on nationalists, much like Mussolini cracked down on those who were not nationalists at his time. So with that in mind, we'll now start to score the two sides, the liberal side, and we'll use Justin Trudeau in Canada as one of the prominent examples of this type of ideology, but then we'll also look at some Democrat states in the United States and some governors and this administration, and compare them to Trump and MAGA folks and maybe Ron DeSantis in Florida to basically score them and try to judge who is really more fascist. So if we examine how tightly integrated corporate world is with political parties and the state apparatus, it seems that the picture is troubling on both sides. I would argue, and most of my friends would argue, that this integration between corporations and political parties is just too advanced on both sides, and this is something we should really watch carefully moving forward. However, if you draw comparisons, there are shades of gray that are interesting and somewhat surprising. For example, if you look at pharma companies and the medical complex, and if you look at blue states in the United States, all of them have universal vaccine mandates at all of their universities, and there is more requirements to get the mandatory vaccine across institutions in the blue states. It's interesting that this is somewhat present in what many would call rhino states, but some of the more MAGA-like states, like Florida, where we have Ron DeSantis as governor, he has explicitly forbidden institutions from imposing vaccine mandates on their students and staff and so forth. Similarly, if you look at Texas and some other red states such as South Dakota, there has been more explicit move away from the big pharma by those MAGA candidates. And it's ironic and interesting that when we talk about fascism nowadays, this is precisely the side that gets accused of being fascist in modern times. So it's an interesting and puzzling phenomenon that we see out there, that it's actually MAGA politicians and MAGA candidates that are moving away and countering the influence of big pharma companies in their states. At the international level as well, Europe and Canada, if you look at the Trudeau regime is liberal, and Canada has very, very strict, stringent, and very, very totalitarian-like requirements with respect to COVID, mandatory vaccinations, and so forth, even some travel restrictions and so forth. So that's an interesting area in which it seems that liberals are more tightly integrated with big pharma interests than especially what we consider the new right or MAGA types or Brexit types in the United States and elsewhere. Similarly, if you look at who gets censored more by big tech, by big platforms, clearly the Republicans, especially the kind of MAGA types, are more censored by the big IT companies than anybody on the left. So that's another one. If you look at the military industrial complex, clearly both Republicans and Democrats have appropriated huge amounts of money, have engaged in similar levels of warmongering and interventionism. But it's interesting that as of recent times, we have only a handful of, again, MAGA-like candidates and politicians on the right within the Republican Party. Unfortunately, not prevalent within the Republican Party, but it's on the right that we find resistance to, or at least questioning of, the military-industrial complex. Finally, if you think about Ron DeSantis, which is one of the really prominent examples of a MAGA politicians nowadays, somebody who openly supports Donald Trump and so forth, he had some interesting showdowns with Disney. That was oftentimes portrayed as part of the culture war, but there is also a subtext that's very economics oriented. And DeSantis basically stepped on Disney's toes with respect to some real regulations and Disney's ability to make money. And there were also serious legal and kind of government implications of Disney status within the state of Florida that Ron DeSantis inherited. Disney had its own security, and it behaved almost like a little state on its properties and having its own security, its own rules, and so forth. And DeSantis curbed that a little. So this is actually very anti-fascist in this sense. And it could be that the big kind of PR drama that unfolded emphasized some cultural aspects of the whole conflict that were maybe hiding this underlying deeper conflict that was going on in there. So if you look at the overall merger between the state and the corporations, the liberal side is more on the side of corporations in reality than especially the MAGA side of the Republican Party. So this is somewhat surprising, but it just seems to be the case. If you disagree, give us some examples in the comment section, and we'd love to see them and hopefully respond to them when we get a chance. Moving on to the typical signs that accompany fascism, a hierarchy is an interesting one that allows us to distinguish pretty clearly between fascist regimes and those that are just corrupt crony capitalist regimes. In crony capitalism, the nature of the regime is carefully hidden and something that everybody likes to pretend is not there. Corruption is wrong, and politicians like to portray themselves as not being corrupt, as being tough on corporations and so forth, even though they're taking their contributions behind the scenes and actually working in their interest. But this is something that they don't want to admit, and they like to pretend that the society is governed by laws that are the same for everybody. There are no special privileges or privileged classes. In fascism, that mask starts to fall, and if anything, these regimes would like to portray this kind of hierarchical system as something that's normal and try to get us to accept it. That is, they're no longer ashamed of these links, and they may even argue that that's actually the natural state of the world, and that's actually desirable. So watch for hierarchies and signs of hierarchy. If you remember the big gala at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where lots of corporate types and lots of rich New Yorkers got together with the political elite to celebrate the museum and generate donations and have a good time in the process. And if you remember, Alejandria Ocasio-Cortez was there in her fancy, expensive dress, which proclaimed tax the rich. One of the details that many people noticed was that even though New York requirements basically were for everybody to wear a mask, the elite didn't wear masks, and all the servants and all the accompanying staff was masked. And those pictures, that they were in the thousands, that were published on the internet and in various journals, invariably showed how this kind of rich, sophisticated elite was schmoozing and having a good time while everybody else was masked. The same was the story with the big birthday celebration of Barack Obama at Martha's Vineyard, and we see this over and over again. So that could be a troubling sign of the oligarchy trying to normalize this idea that some people are just more equal than others, or outright so special that some rules don't apply to them, whereas everybody else should obey them. Similar story with Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, having a fancy dinner at a very expensive restaurant in Napa Valley, I believe. During the lockdown, when everybody else was under lockdown, they were partying together, having a really good time at the super fancy restaurant with nobody wearing a mask. A similar thing with Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, who imposes very, very strict and draconian measures on his country, but then gets caught without a mask at parties and so forth. Similarly, Hollywood does the same thing, and moreover, if you think about all the Hollywood parties and all the festivals and all the extravaganzas that they attend, and they go there with private jets and so forth, but then you are supposed to control your CO2 emissions and limit the driving of your car. I seem to see less of that kind of hypocrisy on the right than on the left, and especially here on the MAGA side. We see very little of that. If anything, the argument is that the rules should be the same for everybody. So here again, a troubling sign for the liberals in the United States and across the world, as far as this idea of a hierarchy and how people think of themselves and how they think about the society that they govern. It seems that things are more troubling on the liberal side. Authoritarianism is another characteristic of fascist societies that distinguish them from just corrupt crony capitalism. Given the nature of corrupt crony capitalist systems, they will like to pretend that rules are followed, that laws are obeyed, and so forth. In a more fascist society, various executives and various branches of government will feel emboldened and empowered to just make arbitrary decisions without much recourse, and even if they violate some laws and procedures. And we see this in the United States. We saw this in many blue states via arbitrary, really decisions to hurt certain businesses, to shut them down. These decisions killed many small businesses, especially restaurants in New York and other blue states, and benefited large corporations such as Amazon, Walmart, and others that were not subject to those draconian measures. So closing down businesses, imposing vaccine mandates, deciding not to follow certain laws, it seems that that's more prevalent in blue liberal states and cities than in the red ones. So according to this dimension, again, a somewhat surprising result that actually liberals are in this regard more fascist than conservatives or MAGA folks. And again, internationally, we see this in New Zealand, in Trudeau's Canada, and elsewhere. So again, something to think about. Probably the most important measure of how fascist a society is the state of individual rights and freedoms. And here again we see a troubling comparison in which the more liberal or nominally left a government or a governor is, the worse it gets for individuals. We see there's also collaboration between the states and the corporate world in cracking down on individual rights, especially freedom of speech. Today's you can your main venue to exercise your freedom of speech are social networks. You can of course go out to the public square and yell your opinions, but that's not something that we do these days. People go on Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere to express themselves. And it's interesting how big corporations and liberal governments have oftentimes in concert cracked down on certain opinions and positions that they don't like, whether it's about political preferences or even things that should not really be political in any sense. COVID policies, different kinds of treatment, even doctors have been censored online because of opinions that certain censors didn't like, and that's not a hallmark of a free society, but of a fascist society. And it's troubling that problems seem to be worse in nominally liberal states and municipalities and so forth. So that's something that's really food for thought for a lot of us. If you think about Canada, for example, where you have liberal government, we had some truly astonishing and troubling examples of people's right to protest and assemble and speak up was explicitly cracked down on. Moreover, and this is something that's just really horrendous, this idea of freezing bank accounts of people who just supported those truckers that were driving across Canada, eventually converged on the capital. Some people made contributions because they supported the truckers, and they ended up having their bank accounts frozen, thank God, temporarily. temporarily, but if you think about seriousness of that move and how frightening that is, and especially the fact that this was done by a liberal government, that's something that should all give us all pause, and we should recognize it as a fact. We cannot ignore this aspect of the current moment that we are living, and that is the fact that some liberal governments have really cracked down on individual freedoms in ways that were unimaginable 2 years ago. And then not to mention the horrendous stories that we hear from Australia and New Zealand, where people are arrested on the beach, and really some basic human rights being violated with COVID given as an excuse. So in this regard, again, liberals and left side is definitely more in violation of democratic principles and more in tune with what are fascist practices. We should name things the way we see them. And we come to the fourth measure, which is nationalism. Here, clearly, MAGA, Brexit, and Rassemblement National in France, these right-wing populist parties are clearly more nationalist, and in that regard, they are ahead of liberals and left parties across the world, and the United States in particular. However, if you think about the classical Mussolinian nationalism that was used to expand and attack neighboring countries, and is used to crack down internally on people who disagree, this moment is not really present. However, if you think about globalism as a counterpart to nationalism, and if you think about liberal and left governments basically pushing globalism and this idea of anti-nationalism, they're oftentimes not that gentle in their pushing of those agendas. So they have collaborated with the corporate world to crack down and limit freedom of speech of nationalists. So here it's an interesting tie. And I invite you to look at the previous video on these thoughts, because it seems that this final dimension of that has been traditionally thought of as part of fascism is kind of put in, is questionable at this point. Is the modern fascism going to be nationalist or globalist? I would argue that given the nature of the globalized economy and given the tremendously powerful global corporations in the IT space, it's difficult to see them pushing nationalism as they merge with state governments and international bodies, frankly. One of the differences between our world today and the world in which original fascism developed is that we have a ton of supranational organizations and bodies such as World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, various trading blocs, European Union, and so forth. And these bodies are increasingly taking some sovereignty from the traditional states. These are places where decisions are made, and these are places that are clearly targeted by global corporations to exercise their influence. And it's difficult to see how at these levels corporations would have any interest in pursuing any kind of nationalist agendas. So with that, if you look at the overall score, it's troubling for the left and for the liberals. If you look at many recent articles and videos on YouTube and elsewhere, and this particular video that I'm recording will be posted on YouTube and Rumble, most others argue that fascism equals Nazism, nationalism, and that therefore everybody who is a nationalist is automatically a fascist or a Nazi. This is just not true. First of all, Nazism is separate and distinct from fascism. so that's a topic for another video. But in the strict Mussolinian sense, I think that the score is pretty clear. Liberals and Trudeau's of the world and Jacinda Ardern's of New Zealand are more fascist than MAGA or Brexit ever were. And this is something that needs to be said. If you look at the objective facts, that just seems to be the case. If you disagree, please give us a comment. If you like what you heard, please share this video, give us a thumbs up, and you may want to follow us and subscribe to this channel. This channel doesn't produce too many videos. We will not bother you with too many notifications, but if you'd like to follow us, that would be great, because that would make this video circulate more and be shown to more people. We do topics of various nature, and we given our background, we sometimes make videos in Serbian. You can skip those and just focus on the ones that are in English, such as this one. So with that, thank you all so much, and let's keep in touch. Thank you.